Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining once again. I massively appreciate it, as ever. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. I say it every week. I've no idea if you actually can or not. Let me see if I can see your chat. Hold on one second, because I can't at the moment. Here we go. There you are. Right, let me drag that over there. Hello, everybody. Hello from Virginia to Toby Kenobi. Greetings from Wisconsin, Michael. Thank you very much for joining. All over the world, as ever. I hope you all have a great Easter weekend, says Paul Van. Likewise, you guys too. The house is finally done. The house is, our house is ever done. This house is nearly done. And yes, you've seen me broadcast from this very room when it was a building site all the time last year. It's now not a building site, and I'm very, very happy to be back in it. So thank you. Hi from Amsterdam. Hello to you. Coosed in the UK. Hello. Thank you. Wow, it looks like a finished room. That's bizarre. Yeah, I know. Believe me, this is a new thing for me, being broadcasting from a finished room. It's wonderful to be back in the house. It's been a long, hard slog. I know it's a first world problem, but it's been lovely to get back in. Anyway, thank you for joining. We're going to talk Formula One, as ever, talking about the Australian Grand Prix. And there is quite a lot to talk about, isn't there? Because I'll give you my very quick overview of what I thought the Grand Prix was like. And actually, not unlike many Australian Grand Prix from Albert Park, I thought the racing was relatively dull. Don't know if you think that's controversial or not. What spiced it up was, of course, all the chaos, the incidents that caused the multiple red flags, the crashes, the car failures. It was those kind of unpredictable elements that gave us a little bit of excitement in this Grand Prix. If you took that away, the actual on-track racing was pretty boring. And that's the nature of Albert Park in the modern era. Nothing, I don't want to take anything away from the organisers of the Australian Grand Prix Corporation, because they do a wonderful job. It's a brilliant event. It was always one of my favourites. But the track itself, even though they made some changes, which I do think have helped, by the way, the changes they made in recent times, it's a track that I think modern Grand Prix cars have outgrown a little bit. It is quite old school, it is quite narrow, the walls are very close, and yet the cars in Formula One today have grown bigger and bigger and bigger, wider, longer, heavier, and I just think it's one of those circuits that doesn't necessarily suit modern Formula One. But there you go, that's just my take on it. Having said all of that, there was a lot going on, and therefore a lot to talk about. Let me know what you think. What I want to do, and it's slightly different this week, I want you to answer this question as we go through the evening. At any point, if you think you've got an answer, pop it in the chat, and I'll try and pick up on them and come back to it. Because I have a question which is centred around the red flag rules, where at the moment we know anybody can change tyres for free under the red flag situation. Now, I don't think it's a great rule. I think it's sometimes spoils the racing. I think it's all about luck, and I know that these things always happen around luck. A red flag, a yellow flag, a crash, somebody breaking down, they're all part of what makes up the unpredictability of any live sporting event. I get that. However, a red flag situation, which is often at the discretion of the stewards, like we saw in Australia, can completely shift the perspective of the race, given that people will get a free choice of tyres. So if you've already made your pit stop, your race is effectively ruined. My question to you is, what should we do? If we can agree that that's not a great rule and we should try and think of an alternative, what is that alternative? And you can just come back to me at this over the course of the next hour. Is it that nobody gets a free change of tyres? And bear in mind, the reason the rule is there in the first place is that if there's a red flag, it's quite often because there's been an accident and therefore there might be debris on the circuit, and so people will have damage to their tyres. That's the reason the rule's there. And I understand that. That makes some sense. So if we need to keep that element of it, how do we negate this idea of people getting a free pit stop or a free tyre change and effectively completely flipping race strategy on its head just because of a red flag? Let me know your thoughts. So they should ban tyre changing and any other work on the car, says Summer Farmer States. I think the problem with that is, like I just described, the reason the rule's there is a good one. Because a red flag is almost always after a big incident where there's debris right across the circuit, and quite often you've got damage to tyres where people have run over bits of cars on the racetrack, that becomes a safety issue. So allowing people to change tyres, I think, makes sense. But should we still enforce another pit stop in a Grand Prix? Should we enforce people to only switch onto the same type of tyre, for example? A whole bunch of different solutions to the same problem, but might find a way to negate the issue of it flipping the race strategy like it currently does. Keep things the same as they are, says Michael. And again, that's a perfectly good solution. If we don't think it's a problem, keep it as we are. There is a part of me that absolutely accepts that sometimes you get the luck of the draw and sometimes you don't. And that's fair enough as well. I've been on the winning side of that and the losing side in my time in Formula 1 too, so I understand that. So when everyone leaves the pit lane, they can stay back to do the work. When everyone leaves the pit lane, they can stay back to do the work. Don't understand that one, sorry. Not sure what you mean by that. If you pit, you have to start from the pits. Well, everyone's going to pit. So if you change tyres, you're going to start from the pits. I guess, again, it's one of those... I think probably what I'm convincing myself of here is there is no perfect solution to this, because all of these ideas are all perfectly good. They all have merit and all have value, but they're all going to have a moment when one of those solutions will favour somebody on one day and it might really hamper somebody on another. And I think probably the answer is that's just the nature of a live sporting event like Formula 1. It's unpredictable, and sometimes the cards fall in your favour and sometimes they don't. We should change tyres, but that won't count to a mandatory 2 types of pit stop. So that's a sort of an obvious answer to this, isn't it? Where you can change tyres on those safety grounds just in case there's been damage, but it doesn't count towards your mandatory tyre change. I guess the problem with that is we had a red flag yesterday with 3 or 4 laps to go. Now, if you still had to make a pit stop after that, it's not much time. I guess you wouldn't be leaving a pit stop that late in most cases in the race anyway. So, look, there's lots of solutions. I think probably the answer is that it's always going to, or it's never going to be a perfect solution for everybody. That's probably the takeaway here. Let's move it on. And if someone has an amazing idea, I will try and come back to it. Right. Right, let's come back to, let's move it on to a different topic. And of course, you're all answering that question now, which is exactly what I asked you to do. So let's move on to the idea of having these red flags in yesterday's race in the first place. Were they justified? I've seen a lot of people tweeting me and a lot of people talking online to say that the first one, at least, which was brought out for all that gravel that came onto the circuit, wasn't necessary to have a red flag. I think there's a good argument to say it was. I think it was probably one of those that if it hadn't been a red flag, perhaps you'd have been able to argue and justify that it wasn't required. But as it was a red flag, I think there's every justification for bringing that red flag out. I don't believe anyone called that in terms of trying to spice up the show at that point, because I don't think it even did spice up the show at that stage in the Grand Prix. They brought it out because the circuit was covered in gravel. There were a few car parts lying around as well. But actually the gravel is something that, it's like riding on marbles. As you come around that corner at quite high speed, it would provide a serious danger threat. And to get people onto the circuit to clean it up, I think would just take too long. And if you're going to bring marshals onto the circuit to sweep that gravel away, probably that's going to take you 2 or 3 laps of a safety car if you went down that route, in the gap between that bunched up train of cars passing through. Or you just call the red flag, you get it done properly, and you get going again. So I didn't really have an issue with that one. I don't think that we have a solution to this end of race red flag scenario yet. I'm not sure we need one, is my biggest answer. Of course, the reason we got the red flag right towards the end all stems back from twofold. One, the Abu Dhabi 2021, where a lot of people complained that we didn't have a red flag in that kind of scenario. We get a couple of laps of free racing towards the end of the Grand Prix, which does provide excitement. I think that's part of the reason that we're seeing a few more of these things and are a bit more ready to bring the red flag out, particularly in those situations now, because entertainment is an important factor. Whether we like it or not from a sporting context, it's an important factor. So that's, I think, the reason that a lot of these things are happening. But there is this slight sort of paradoxical situation here where we bring that red flag out towards the end when there's been an incident, because it's obviously a safety issue. But actually, as we saw yesterday, when you go for a restart, particularly towards the end of the race when no one's got anything much to lose and it's all about trying to desperately make up positions in 1 or 2 flying laps, it actually presents a pretty significant danger. And as we saw yesterday, the chance of catastrophic collisions and accidents and things going wrong are incredibly high, even higher than they would be right at the very start of the Grand Prix perhaps. And of course that's exactly what played out. So there is this difficulty, this balance between entertainment and safety and the danger elements that come from having a standing restart that late in the race, when there are literally points and prizes on offer just a couple of laps after that restart happens. That puts the element of risk versus reward right at the forefront of everybody's minds. And I think that risk versus reward measurement is changed towards the end of the race compared to what it is at the start. So there is a bit of a difficulty there. Rolling start when everyone's on hard tyres or in the last 20 laps, says Giges. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong there. But yeah, rolling start towards the end. There's actually a good argument that should be the case. Whether it's a handful of laps from the end, a rolling start is definitely the safer option. That's just a fact. It may not provide the same level of excitement, but if we're that far into the race, people's race strategies have already played out in the most part. So a standing start almost feels like you're just rolling the dice, when actually the entertainment side of that decision is probably a bit more paramount than anything else when it comes to that stage in the race. And maybe that's why the decisions are being made. 10 to go, no red flags if a caution comes out. So yes, another fair option if there's only 10 laps to go. Actually, another question that I've had a couple of times today, and this is worth explaining, is a lot of people say, why don't they just red flag the race and stop it? Because that's what we used to do. If the red flag came that late in the race, that was the result. You take the result from the end of the last flying completed lap, and that was your race result. They wouldn't have restarted it with 3 laps to go. Well, since they changed the rules to incorporate this time-limited Grand Prix, we have 3 hours now, don't we, to complete a Grand Prix from start to finish. If there's still time on that clock, the rules actually state that you have to keep restarting. If the opportunity is there and that time limit is there to give everybody enough light and time to get the race done, if there's still time on the clock, you have to keep restarting, presuming that the circuit, of course, is safe to do so. And that's exactly what they did. So that's the reason behind it. In days gone by, it would have just been the end of the race, and that would have been it. And we've done that many, many times. But again, coming back to this idea of spectacle, keeping the viewers happy, getting a little bit of racing done towards the end is what is decided as being the best. And as we know from 2021 in Abu Dhabi, there's a collective feeling that trying to get the race ending under green flag conditions is always going to be preferable than doing it under things like safety car situations. And that's something that all teams, by the way, have agreed upon. So that's an idea or agreement that all the stakeholders in the sport have expressed an interest in seeing happen, and that's what they tried to do yesterday. So my overriding feeling is they didn't really get too much wrong in terms of following the rules yesterday. The bigger question is, should we think about tweaking the rules, in my opinion. Happy birthday, Elvis. Well, thank you very much, but it isn't my birthday. But I'll take it. Thanks, James Robert. Right. Right. Hold on. Okay, give me another one. Okay, so F1 Fiend says, I think the stewards got it exactly right. The issue is the lack of communication, which leads to... Oh, I've lost you. Where's it gone? Oh, there we go. The issue is that it leads to... or is a lack of communication, which leads to a lack of trust. It needs a Scott Elkins personality like Formula E as he explains all his decisions. That's an interesting one, and Formula E does do this, and they do it publicly. They do it over the TV broadcast as well. It goes into the driver's ears and then is therefore broadcast to the world. The race director in Formula E does explain, a little bit like an American football referee, explains their decision-making on the fly as it's happening. They're talking to the drivers, and that's being broadcast. And actually, it's quite an interesting concept. I guess it puts a bit of pressure onto those guys in race control, the race director especially. as they're often trying to deal with multiple situations, trying to come up with multiple solutions to different problems at the same time. There can be difficulties around that, but if that was a rule that was brought in, there'd have to be somebody, the race director presumably, dedicated to doing that, to explaining decisions, being front-facing and talking to the drivers and the public about why they've made a decision and what's happening in the next few minutes. That's what you get in Formula E, and that is actually something I really like. So I agree with you on that one. Okay, James Key. Okay, James Key question mark. Says Sandy Barnes. Yeah, why not? Let's talk about McLaren. A lot of changes at McLaren on the technical side, the biggest of which is that James Key is no longer there. And is it a surprise? I don't think it's a huge surprise. I think it's a little bit, I don't know. I don't want to criticise them because I don't think this is a quick knee-jerk reaction to the first few races of 2023. I think it's potentially a reaction to, as we heard this even pre-season, if you remember, even at the launch of the car, McLaren was saying that we have missed our development targets. They knew that long before a car hit a racetrack. And actually they knew that they were way off their targets. And that's the very reason they went public with that side of things. So if they knew that all that time ago, behind the scenes, there would have been some disgruntlement, there would have been some dissatisfaction, of course, with the technical team that they got things so horribly wrong. And so perhaps from that perspective, it's not a huge surprise that the leader of that technical team does in fact take the fall. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking perhaps they should give him a bit more time, a little bit more time and space to do things differently, but you don't really know exactly what's going on behind those closed doors. But ultimately, it's a results-driven business, and McLaren have disappeared downwards, backwards, from where their trajectory was taking them just 2 seasons ago. And that's not good enough for a team with the ambition that McLaren has, and therefore James Key has been the guy to go. James Key didn't hold the key to success, says Josh Smith. Well, no one person ever holds the key to success. And that's why it's always difficult if it's seen that one person seems to take the fall for any poor results. I don't think that's what's happened. This is all part of a bigger shuffle around on the technical side. James Key's just the most public figure to have disappeared. After a sort of public introduction to the team, he's had a public separation from the team, and that's of course what's going to make headlines. But actually there's a few people shuffled around, moved into new positions, been brought in as well behind the scenes to create this new technical structure that they hope will give them some more longer term success. For that, you can't really criticise. They are looking to build for the future, and I guess if they get that right, we'll all be congratulating them some way down the line. And a problem with reliability in the first 2 races. Yes, they have had issues. In fact, it's been a disastrous first 2 races. Yesterday, they actually got some points. They got something a little bit more decent out of that Grand Prix weekend, but some of that was down to luck rather than outright pace. I thought Lando did a decent job yesterday. In fact, both drivers did a decent job. But that's about as good as that car, I think, is capable of doing. And that's the sign of where McLaren are right now. So to luck into a few extra points they were hoping for, I guess, is a bonus. Have Mercedes sacrificed reliability for more performance? Maria Holland. Thank you, Maria. I did see your message come through earlier on Twitter at #AskElvis. So I was going to answer it anyway, but you've popped it in here too. Thank you. Have Mercedes sacrificed reliability for more performance? Well, reliability versus performance is always a trade-off. It's always a balancing act, because if you make a car lighter, it has less strength typically, and when things have less strength they become weaker in many cases, and that can lead to reliability. It's not all about saving weight, but you always want to try and push the limits of performance at whatever cost that is. Now, sometimes that cost is reliability, and it's about finding the right balance. Essentially, what you want to do is have your racing car last for exactly the right amount of time. That might be 1 Grand Prix. For things like engines and gearboxes, it's a number of Grand Prix. But after that, you don't really need it to last any longer. And if you're building it more substantially and it's lasting for an entire season, you've probably gone too safe on things like the materials or the design structure in those components. If you could dial that back a little bit, maybe make them lighter, make them out of different material that's not quite as durable and long lasting, but will give you more performance, then there's that constant balance that Formula One teams are searching for. So have Mercedes done that? I don't know is the answer to that. But I think what Mercedes have done is this particular weekend, they found the maximum performance out of their car. The issue that George Russell had, I don't think anyone knows what it was yet, fully in detail at least. I don't think it was anything that, I think it was something that was a real surprise to them, not something they've seen signs of already. So this is probably a new one on their radar, and only once they've fully investigated it will they know what the cause is, and therefore whether it does fit into the category that you're talking about there, Maria. But let's talk about Mercedes very quickly, because what Mercedes were able to do this weekend, and I just said this on a short video that's on the SeedStream app. That's my Formula One app that you can go and check out. Links in the description. If you haven't yet downloaded the SeedStream app, please go and do it. Brilliant app for all your F1 content, and it has this SeedStream Predictions League in it. It's not too late to join. You can join at any point and still be competitive by guessing the top 5 drivers and the order they finish in each of the Grand Prix for the rest of the season. But there's massive bonus points on offer. If you get all 5 right, it's not too late to join. Go and do it, believe me. Anyway, the video I've just done on that SeedStream app is all about how I thought that the Australian Grand Prix really highlighted the dominance of that Red Bull RB19, which sounds like a strange thing to say because it was the race where they had their closest competitors of all season so far. And of course that was Mercedes this time out. Mercedes were closer to Red Bull than any team has been at any point so far in 2023. So why am I saying that the Red Bull, it highlighted Red Bull's dominance? The reason I'm saying it is because the circuit and the conditions in Albert Park really suited that Mercedes. It was cooler conditions, particularly on Saturday, and that seemed to suit the Mercedes, certainly way better than the Red Bull. It's a circuit that is not too bumpy. It's quite smooth asphalt as well. And for Mercedes, that meant they could run the car lower, which is, of course, where they want it. That's what's going to give them the extra downforce that they're so desperately craving. And therefore, they were in the sort of sweet spot for that Mercedes car. That was about as good as you're going to get from the Mercedes in its current configuration. Whereas the flip side of that was that Red Bull kind of had the opposite. The cooler temperatures really made them struggle on Saturday, to some extent at least, comparatively. Because it was so cold, they really struggled with tyre temperature. And actually the smooth asphalt probably had the same effect, really struggling to generate tyre temperature, particularly at the front end of the car on that Red Bull, which is one of their, not a weakness, because they don't have many weaknesses in that car, but it's definitely something that is less easy for them to do as it is for some other teams. Now, on some other circuits, of course, they'll do multiple warm-up laps to gently bring those tyres in exactly where they need them. But with the cold temperatures and that smooth asphalt, they still found that hard in Australia. So we saw the worst conditions for a Red Bull and perhaps the best conditions for Mercedes. And yet still on Saturday, Max Verstappen was, 2.5 tenths quicker than Lewis Hamilton. I still think there was more time on the table for Max as well. And in the race, the moment he got the opportunity, that car just disappeared off into the distance by seconds, almost a lap. Within a few laps, he was 3 seconds clear of everybody. Then he was 5 seconds. And before you know it, he'd built up a 10-second lead and was just maintaining that for fun. And that's the pace of that Red Bull. So even though the outright gap and speed difference perhaps wasn't as much as we've seen at other circuits, for me, given the sets of conditions for both cars, it was a real eye-opener. Now imagine when we get to Baku, which is all about that high speed down that long start-finish straight. Imagine when we go to Monza. Imagine how dominant the RB19 is going to be over the rest of the field. It's almost scary. So much so that all of the other teams, I have no doubt, are very carefully evaluating a shift towards that Red Bull concept. Whether it's at some point this season in terms of Mercedes, maybe McLaren, perhaps even others, but certainly beyond that, teams will be looking at how Red Bull have done it, and they can't see any way of improving on what they have managed to do. And so you're probably going to see people starting to converge their designs on something similar to what Red Bull have done over the coming months and certainly into next season. I have no doubt about it. That is a very, very, very strong car. Checo's deal on Saturday? Do you know, I still don't know. And actually, there's something in the fact that we still don't know exactly what happened to Checo, because it did seem like, I mean, Checo was adamant that he was blaming the car, that there was a problem on Saturday afternoon qualifying that was the same problem that he had that caused the various excursions on Saturday morning in FP3. Yet whenever I saw Christian Horner interviews, he was a bit hesitant to sort of say that there was a car problem. I haven't seen there's not been any official press release saying exactly what the problem was. They changed a couple of parts, I seem to remember, in Parc Fermé ahead of the Grand Prix, some braking components, but I think it was just material, discs and pads. So either they had some real anomaly with the brake material at the front end of that car, which seemed strange. It almost felt like it was pushing on. And that's not uncommon, because we even saw Max doing it on Sunday during the Grand Prix at some point. The teams have various settings on the engine that will, to some extent, push the car on deliberately. It helps with certain aspects of getting yourself around the circuit at certain points. Sometimes the drivers want a tiny amount of that. However, not to the point where you end up unable to slow the car down and in the gravel trap at almost every significant stopping zone on the racetrack. And that's what Checo had. So, I don't know. I think there's maybe a little disagreement brewing behind the scenes. Maybe it was just driver error. Maybe Checo was desperate as we got towards qualifying. He'd had very little in terms of practice because of that disrupted morning session. And maybe he was pushing too hard. Maybe it was just a bit of a desperate driver error. Who knows? But there definitely seems to be a discrepancy in what Checo thinks happened and maybe what the team think happened. So who knows where in that it actually sits in reality? Who knows? Right. Hulk podium before retiring or losing the drive. Is it possible? Says Sophia Di Salvo. Is a Hulk podium possible? Well, look, what was he running in fourth towards the end of yesterday's race? I mean, yeah, of course, that was due to a number of incidents happening in front of him, but what a stonking drive. And he's done a really good job since coming in. I mean, that's exactly why the Haas team brought him in. It was a bit of a shame that Kevin had a difficult weekend, because I rate Kevin Magnussen highly, and I think the two of them could actually work really well for the team. Can Hulk get a podium? I mean, under normal circumstances, absolutely no way. We know that under a sort of regular weekend, the top two places on the podium should just be a Red Bull, the two Red Bulls. It should be both of those Red Bulls locking out the first and second places at every Grand Prix, unless they have a major problem. Behind them, there's a flurry of cars, of Aston Martins, of Mercedes, maybe even Ferraris. And after that, even after that, you've still got some work to get a Haas up into that group of cars. So it needs something utterly chaotic, but that's nearly what we had yesterday. So why not? It'd be cool to see, wouldn't it? Finally get him on the podium. What about Gasly getting no penalty, Sargent no penalty, but Carlos getting a 5-second penalty all at the restart? Yeah, do you know what? So Carlos Sainz, you saw him very angry for getting that 5-second penalty, and I have to say I have some sympathy with him. He hit Fernando Alonso, I think, didn't he? And yes, it was Carlos's fault. I don't think anyone can deny that. But it was also effectively the first lap of that race. It was after a red flag, so that's a restart. That's effectively starting a new race. And they're always very lenient on the start of a Grand Prix at the very first lap, because these racing incidents happen. It's actually very difficult. It's actually incredibly hard not to have any contact with anybody when you've got 20 Formula One cars or whatever it was at that stage bustling for position on a particularly narrow track in Albert Park, all looking to get little, positions forward or backwards at some point over those first few corners in the first lap. And so they're always very lenient. And how often do you see incidents requiring no further investigation because it was the first lap of the race? So I did think it was harsh, I have to say. If that same incident had happened at a different point in the race, 5-second penalty, slam dunk, I don't think anyone could argue. But given that it was the first lap, and given that others got away with similar things because it was the first lap. I thought that was a difficult one for Carlos and a harsh one for him to have to put up with. Right, Ricardo let it slip in an interview that Lando is moving next year. Oh, I didn't hear that one. That's a new one on me. However, I mean, maybe not surprising. When does Lando's contract come up? I think he's signed until, is it the end of 24? Have I got that right? Or is it the end of 25 maybe even? But all the rumours are that behind the scenes, Lando is potentially being lined up to lead the Audi team. Don't forget, his former boss at McLaren has gone to run that Audi Formula One team. It's a big manufacturer entry. Audi don't tend to do things by halves. If you think about their Le Mans program, it was huge. They blew everyone out of the water by just throwing the kitchen sink at it. You know, I know Formula One's perhaps not quite that straightforward, but they won't do things by halves. They will do a proper job when it comes to doing Formula One. And if Lando Norris wants to lead a manufacturer team, maybe do a bit of a Lewis Hamilton, then I can see that happening. But next year, I don't know. Next year would definitely be leaving early. And as we heard over the weekend, according to Zach Brown, he has no exit clauses in his contract. So we'll have to wait and see. Do you think Mercedes can beat Red Bull? Says Josh Smith. I don't think they've got any hope of beating them on pure pace at the moment. However, they do talk about huge upgrades coming later in the season. Almost a B-spec car, perhaps even. So if that turns up, who knows what performance that might bring. What Red Bull proved to us is that it is possible to go that quickly within the current regulations. So if Red Bull can do it, there is literally nothing stopping anyone else doing it as well. It's just they haven't done it yet. They didn't think of it, they haven't come up with the same ideas, and they are massively on the back foot. And with the current Formula One regulations, catching up during a season is incredibly hard in today's Formula One. So I can't see, barring again some major problem for Red Bull, I can't see anybody actually outpacing them and beating them on genuine performance over the course of this season, with anything I can see so far. Right. DRS was meant to aid passing. It's become too powerful with too many zones. It's farcical. So we had 4 DRS zones in Albert Park, and I guess many people would think that's too many. It's a lot, isn't it? However, the problem with Albert Park is if you don't have them, then there's just no opportunities for overtaking. And that's the problem, I guess, isn't it? Maybe that particular circuit does need DRS more than some others, but I do agree that at some circuits, in fact, at most other circuits, there's no way we should be having 4 DRS zones, but we're not in most cases. But at some circuits, you could even get to the point where maybe you don't even need DRS. And we're going to go to Baku next, where the straight is about 15 miles long. We don't need DRS, in my opinion, along there. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I think it's one of those, for me, where these regulations we're always hoping to do away with DRS at some point. But if we keep it as a tool in our back pocket of Formula One, and then just apply it depending on the requirements of each circuit, then for me, that's something that we can just utilise when we need it. And Albert Park, in my book, is one of those that does need it. They dropped 1 DRS zone last year. Yes, they did. I mean, it does feel like the cars, and a lot of people have talked about it, the cars seem harder to follow this year compared to last year. And there are some reasons for that. I mean, I know it's the same regulations, more or less, but we've had a lot of work done to front wings over the course of 2022. It was always going to be a big area of development. Particularly, we even had a little bit of wording change in the regs that allows the little flap separators on the front wing flaps to effectively be used as turning vanes. And that's what people are doing with them now. And what they do with that is effectively utilise them to create nowhere near the kind of outwash that we had in previous iterations of F1 cars, but they're creating a little bit more outwash. And probably that's having at least a contributing factor to the fact that we're now creating, if we are creating more outwash, which these regulations were intending to get rid of, you start to create this much bigger turbulent pocket of air which then means it's a little bit harder to follow when you get close behind. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near the problems that we had in the previous versions of F1 cars, but perhaps we are getting a little bit more, just a tiny bit more into that zone than we were last year. I still think it's better than we were 2 years previous to that, but perhaps that's the direction that development is potentially going. Should Max lift and coast more to bring back some excitement in a race? Now, Robin Visser says that. Now, I'm sure that's a tongue-in-cheek comment, but we talked about this. I think we might have talked about this on my podcast last week, perhaps. There is a situation now where Max Verstappen and Red Bull have to have in their back of their mind, if they are, pulling out 10-second gaps every race over everybody, if they're blitzing people by nearly a second a lap in qualifying, the FIA, Formula One, are going to start looking at rule changes to peg them back, to hamper their progress. And because they want the show to be, entertaining. Now, Red Bull, of course, don't want that. And so there is actually an argument from a Red Bull perspective, and I wouldn't blame them for thinking along these lines, of managing their own performance so they don't make it look too easy. And that might set off alarm bells for all sorts of people. But if you're a Formula One team, you're looking to exploit anything you can to give yourself an advantage. And they've got such a big advantage right now, it's probably not in their interests to continuously show exactly how big that advantage is, because it might come back to bite them at some point when they decide to change rules to peg them back, at some point later this season or next. We'll have even more movable aero, aka DRS, from 2026 for even lower fuel use. We will have some kind of active aero coming in 2026, absolutely. And that's something I'm really excited about. I don't think it's not just going to be another version of DRS. There's a lot of work going on in the background right now about how to make that the most efficient possible, and perhaps how it can be adapted and learnt from to be applied in other areas like the road car industry, for example, perhaps. Movable active aero seems like a natural progression to me, because it can make the cars a little bit more efficient and save fuel, as you said, but it's also a technical solution that I think makes total sense. These are Formula One cars that at the moment we have to pile on the downforce because they need that to corner so quickly, but we're just accepting that comes with this huge drag penalty down the straight. When the technology is there and has been there for years, where actually we could really maximise having the downforce in the corners and dumping the drag on the straights when we don't need it. This is Formula One. It's the pinnacle of race engineering. So I absolutely think we should employ that technology and try and find ways to get the best out of it. Bring back the F-duct. Yeah, there you go. That was an early version of it, wasn't it? So here's a good one, and I've talked about this many times from Summer Farmer States. Just tell the teams that you've got 145 million to build the car, and then you go and build the car however you want to build it. And it's never going to be quite that straightforward, but I actually do agree that now that we're in this budget-capped era of Formula One, many of the things that are banned, many of the technologies are banned on cost grounds. Many of the materials are banned on cost grounds. So if we've already capping costs and people can't just spend what they want, why not just let them go for it? Why not just let them do whatever they want and spend that set amount of money on whatever they want to spend it on? I think that would be fascinating. I know that eventually we'd have a convergence like we do whenever there's a new set of rules. Eventually you'd probably get people converging on the same kind of solutions, spending their money in pretty much the same way. But for a few years, we'd get something, I think, that's quite varied and exciting. You never know how that's going to play out, because it could be that one team absolutely nails the rules like we've got today and others are struggling in comparison. But look, this is Formula One, and unless you're going to give everyone the same cars up and down the grid, you always have to accept that someone's going to do a better job than someone else, and therefore there's going to be a performance spread. We can't complain that Red Bull have absolutely smashed this car and done a wonderful job. We should celebrate that's what they've done. And the only way we're really going to overcome that, if we want to keep everybody in the same level playing field, is give everybody the same car. Don't really believe there's a better solution than that. Size and weight restrictions only, says Tony Roberts. Yeah, fair play. And safety, of course. Yeah, so a lot of people agreeing with that and saying you might get totally different cars. I think you possibly would, particularly in the short term, as I said. Do they design a car with DRS in mind or with the rear wing closed? Well, both is the answer to that. So when you're designing a Formula One car, you're having to consider all of those solutions. And actually what we're seeing this year, you've probably heard a lot of people talking about it, how Red Bull have seemingly managed to make their DRS solution more efficient than other people. Now, that almost certainly didn't happen by accident. That's some thought process gone into that. That's simulating what happens when the wings open. It's running it in the wind tunnel with the wing open and wing closed. You want, as I said earlier, you want maximum downforce within your configuration for the twisty bits, for the corners when you need it. And then you want to dump as much of that drag as possible when you don't need it on the straights. And with DRS being a tool to do that, it would make total sense to factor that into your design and your development procedures with both wing open and wing closed. So almost nothing happens by accident in Formula One. So the answer to your question is they look at both states of that rear wing when designing the car. Remember the 5 foot high wings and 6 wheels? Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of thing. Maybe giving a restricted budget, but an open budget in terms of what you spend it on could encourage a bit more innovation. And I'd love to see that. I agree. Right. Disable DRS for the top 3 drivers of the previous race. That's interesting. Disable DRS for the top 3 finishers of the previous race. Yeah, interesting one. Do you know what? I quite like the concept of that. Doing it from the previous race, I'm not sure is the right way to go. But what you could potentially do is disable DRS for the top 3 cars in the current race. The first 3 positions on the current race maybe don't get DRS. I suppose the problem with that is that the guys in second and third will be desperate to get back past into first place, and you start to limit the overtaking opportunities there. But I quite like the idea that at least maybe, here's a starting point for you, the leader of the race should not get DRS when they're coming up behind back markers. I mean, that is something for me that I feel is a bit silly. If you're the leader of the race, the whole point of the DRS system is to allow those behind to catch up. And if you're getting it just by picking up a toe off a car in front that you're about to lap, it seems to sort of negate the point of the DRS. The leader should never have DRS. That was the original intention. Only the chasing pack should get DRS when they're close enough to be able to close down on the leader. That's the idea. What do you think of Hamilton's driving in that race, says Greg Smith? I thought Hamilton did a great job, wonderful job. I think he sort of came under a period of pressure from Fernando Alonso, but that was never sustained pressure. And so actually in the end, he was largely in a race of his own, wasn't he, for much of it? Max was way out in front and disappeared. Lewis was he had to stave off the pressure from Alonso behind, but when that fight sort of disappeared, and he did that for a long period, to be fair, so he did a really good job there. When that challenge sort of faded away, he was kind of on his own, wasn't he? And that's almost the state of play in Formula One. Red Bull are out in front in a race of their own. This race, we had Mercedes almost taking the place of Ferrari, really, in terms of the next big challenger, with Aston Martin on a very similar level. And that's probably going to swing back and forwards a little bit at different circuits week to week. And so that battle, particularly the battle between the second, third and fourth place teams, is probably going to be one of the most interesting over the course of this season. Keep your eyes on it. Right. Is battery power strong enough to pass? Yeah, absolutely. Battery power definitely is, but the problem is everyone's got it. So unlike DRS, where only the guy behind gets it, with battery power, if you know you're in a fight with somebody, you can harvest the energy and save up your battery power to use it to defend as well as to attack. So yes, it absolutely is a big boost of performance. But if the guy in front knows that you're coming and is ready to defend with his button, they kind of cancel each other out. It would be great to get an Aston Martin win. It would be cool, wouldn't it? It would be really cool, I think. I think there's a very high chance that Red Bull, one or the other of them, will win every single race this season. And it is almost certainly, as I said earlier, going to take something weird and strange for that not to happen. However, the guy that's consistently there in the wings just waiting is Fernando Alonso, and it's Aston Martin. So there's got to be some kind of incident where the two Red Bulls take each other out, or we have some kind of car failures. We've seen it at times. They're not infallible. And therefore, if Fernando Alonso is the guy that's just waiting in the wings, there's nothing to say he might not get that elusive race win. What was it, 10 years ago he had his last race win? I can't remember, but how good a story would that be? It'd be brilliant. Right. Last non-Alpine drivers to take each other out. Blimey. Would it have been Mercedes? Couldn't have been as far back as Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton in 2016? Could it? I can't remember. You guys will know that. Who are the last pair of teammates other than Alpine drivers to wipe each other out? Interesting. I know that Lance Stroll hit Fernando Alonso earlier this season, but he didn't take him out, so I'm guessing that doesn't count. Let me know. Red Bull, Max and Ricciardo. No, that would have been before Lewis and Nico, wouldn't it? Racing Point, says Josh Smith. Yeah, very clever. Okay. Right. Right, here we go. Fernando looks so much happier this year. Fernando's in a great place right now. He's exciting to watch. Oh, here's a good question. Somebody asked me this, and apologies because I forget who it was, but somebody asked me on Twitter earlier on today, hashtag Ask Elvis. Do we think that, and you can put your 2 pennies worth in here, do you think that Sebastian Vettel would be getting the kind of results that Fernando Alonso's getting in the Aston Martin if he were in that car this year? And my immediate answer to that was, I don't think he would. And I mean no disrespect to Sebastian Vettel. I have all the time in the world for Sebastian. He's a wonderful driver, brilliant world champion. But I think towards the end, he'd lost a little bit of mojo. And partly that might have been because the car wasn't good. And maybe that mojo comes back when the car starts to improve. But I think what we get from Fernando is more exciting, aggressive driving than we would have got from Sebastian Vettel. And maybe at times it's that means we look at Fernando's performances with a big smile on our face and we desperately want him to get a good result. I think a lot of people loved Sebastian Vettel, and a great result for Sebastian would have also been equally popular, but I'm not sure we get quite that aggression from him that we've got or are getting right now from Fernando Alonso. So, yeah, a lot of you seemingly agreeing. Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc in 2019 wiped each other out. Good shout. K.O. Rengarder. Yeah, a lot of people saying that unfortunately don't think Sebastian Vettel would have got those results. How about using wind ballast, says SJ. There's an interesting question. Success ballast, been used in many other categories of racing and at times quite successfully. And the idea is if you win the previous race, for the next race you get, 5 kilos of ballast added to your car in a safe place on the car that's the same for everybody. And of course you're carrying that extra ballast around, which in turn brings your performance down. The idea behind it is relatively fair. If you're going to start to penalise people's performance, success ballast is one of the best ways to do it, I think. my feeling is it's one of those things that Formula One shouldn't really be entertaining the idea of. And if we are going to do that, we need to think about what we want most out of Formula One. And it comes down to this idea. I always look at this from a team's perspective, having been in one for so long. If I was still inside the team and we'd done a brilliant job, and the result of that brilliant job was we get penalised for it, you're going to feel hard done by. I know there's similar things in terms of the aero development restrictions that we currently have in the current set of rules, and I understand that. So I guess it's one of those, it's a philosophical question really, rather than anything technical. We know technically it works. And if we applied it right now, Max Verstappen would be applying ballast to his car for the next race. Would it be enough? Probably not. He'd need a lot of ballast to slow him down enough for everyone else to catch up. But the idea is one that we know works. Really, the decision would be, do we want to go down that sort of route with Formula One or not? No penalising success, says Neil Pritchard. No thanks, says Patrick Leclerc. Weight penalty, good idea, says Rhinos Racercom 66. If you're going to do ballast or something else, you may as well go full balance of performance. Yeah, that's another way of doing it, where you limit the performance via things like engine management systems, for example. But that really is manipulating the series to the point where if that's really your priority, why not just give everyone the same car? Why not make it a faster version of GP2 or F2 rather? Because that's how you get everybody running really closely. F2 races are great entertainment because they've all got the same car. And we could do that in Formula One, but then it wouldn't be Formula One. There would be no point in having teams in the same way we have them now. You wouldn't be designing cars. The factories would become redundant, as well as many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people up and down the pit lane. It's not Formula One to go down that route. And if someone does a great job like Red Bull are doing this year, we should celebrate that. We should embrace it. We should enjoy the performance we're seeing. I know that it gets boring, and I know that if they're not your team, you're going to hate it right now. But as a Formula One neutral fan, I think we should celebrate the brilliance of a team that have done exactly what they set out to achieve in an unbelievably successful way. Build a better car, period, says Tony Roberts. And that, I have to say, I agree with. Everybody had the same set of regulations, the same opportunity, more or less, to build the car that Red Bull built, but no one did it apart from Red Bull. Aston Martin were switched on enough to last year see the potential in what Red Bull were doing and throw away their old car and bring out a car that was pretty much a copy of the Red Bull. So they took it, and look what results they're getting right now. I'm not saying everyone should just go ahead and copy Red Bull, but Red Bull have done a better job than everybody else, and that's something that should be rewarded, not penalised, in my book. Mark, you look like you've lost weight. Are you okay? Thanks very much. I am okay. I may well have lost weight, but that's because I've been working out and eating better. So yes, hopefully I am okay, but thanks for your concern. F2 and F3 is amazing racing and entertainment. Exactly right, because they've got the same cars. So if that's the most important factor, then there's your solution. But if it's not, if we also love Formula One for the technical brilliance, for the engineering innovation, for these constant battles of development throughout a season, which we're losing to some extent with the current set of restrictions around resource and testing and those kind of things. But if that's what we love about Formula One, we need to embrace that and celebrate it within the regulations. So maybe that idea that we talked about earlier, opening up the technical regs because we're now capped on a financial regulation, might be a really interesting way, in my book, to do that. Right, 5 minutes to go. Haas, the most improved team behind Aston Martin, possibly, or even Williams. What a great result Williams were on for yesterday until that, what looks like an error from Alex Albon. It did look to me like he clipped the wall at the previous corner, or at least ran very close to it, ran over the curb, and that's probably what damaged the tyre that led to the eventual failure, because he lost it on turning. It was a very unusual accident. But if you go back in the replay, it did look like he possibly just made contact with the wall. That might have been the problem there. So yeah, Red Bull, Williams rather, I think have made a giant leap forward if you take a percentage improvement over where they were last year. But Haas have also done a really good job. Ferrari, have they taken a giant leap forward? I don't think they have. Ferrari have disappointed me, in all honesty, because Ferrari had perhaps the biggest potential to take a giant leap forward because their car was already good, and actually what they really had to fix was the operational side. It was getting the decisions right. It was operating the car in the right way. And there was huge opportunity to just fixing that side of things. It was human error on many occasions, whether it was strategy, whether it was communication. There was a massive chance for Ferrari to take a big leap forward just by improving those things. And so far, we haven't seen that happen. So perhaps a missed opportunity for Ferrari. Hit the like button, says Remy Kolk. Thank you. Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Hit that like button if you don't mind. That would be great. Thank you very much. Right. Will the rise of America in F1, do you think, with the rise of America in F1, do you think the teams being mostly based in the UK is under threat? I don't think it's under threat. I do think there's not quite the same need to be in the UK as there used to be. There's a couple of reasons that Formula One teams are all based here. One is that there is a talent pool of people. Engineering, on the engineering side, there's a huge section of that talent pool here in the UK. We've got some great degree courses now at universities and colleges. We've got all the experience, of course, is all here. So people move around from one of those teams to the other. That's a lot harder to do if your team is set up somewhere further afield. To attract that talent out of a UK-based team to then move abroad, it's not out of the question, but it's definitely harder to do. So that's one thing. In the old days, there's this legacy reason, which was the section of the sort of sub-industries that supply Formula One teams was also all centred around the UK. But today, we use less and less of that. And with modern Formula One factories getting bigger and bigger and people making more and more of the car themselves in-house, there's less of a need to rely on a sort of infrastructure around the UK that supplies many of the components, because most Formula One teams now make almost all of it themselves. So it's not quite the same reason that you have to be in the UK they used to be. It does make it harder if you're abroad, particularly from a human resources perspective. And I don't think just because we're racing in the States, we need to see teams moving their infrastructures out there or setting up in the States either. There's not really any need for it. You can travel around the world from wherever you're based, and actually having the talent pool in the UK is probably still quite a big pool. Right, a minute to go. Yeah, Phantom Tetra, beer o'clock. It is, in fact, today it's whiskey o'clock, so cheers. I hope you all have a brilliant, 3 weeks is it? 4 weeks till the next race. This is a huge gap now that the Chinese Grand Prix has been cancelled. If you're going away or having some kind of break over this Easter period, if you celebrate Easter, enjoy yourselves. Make the most of the time off. Make the most of not having your weekends taken up by Formula One, and whatever it is you're up to, have a brilliant time. Don't forget, please go and check out my podcast. If you haven't yet seen it, we dropped episode 60 just this morning, the end of season 6. So you haven't seen it yet, the 60 episodes to go and peruse at your leisure. And maybe that's how you could spend the next few weeks until Formula One is back. If you're going to do that, I'd appreciate it. Let me know, drop me a message, tag me in all of your posts if you're sharing, if you're talking about Formula One. I'd love to hear from you, and I will catch you all very, very soon. Have fun. See you later.